still coming in the door. I hope you enjoyed your lunches. I know it was a little fast. There's so much to share with one another. There's an amazing group of radical women in this room, so I'm sure the lunches have been very fruitful. So welcome back to our program. Before we jump in, I know there are many educators in the room, and I just wanted to share that if you're interested in bringing your class to the Hammer to view the Radical Women exhibition, either for a self-guided visit or for a guided visit, you can submit a request form online at hammer.ucla.edu/visit/tours. Also, if you haven't already picked up your Radical Women exhibition catalog, which is beautiful and comprehensive, they are available for purchase upstairs in our Hammer store, which is open today until 6 p.m. So I encourage you to go and pick one up. Now back to our program. I am honored to introduce our second moderator of the day, Andrea Giunta. Andrea Giunta is an art historian and curator specializing in Latin American and contemporary art based in Buenos Aires. She is also, of course, co-curator of the Radical Women exhibition, which I hope that you had a chance to see a little bit of over lunch. Andrea is a researcher at the National Scientific and Technical Research Council, Buenos Aires, and professor of Latin American art at the Universidad de Buenos Aires. She held the chair in Latin American art history and criticism at the University of Texas at Austin, where she was also, from 2008 to 2013, the founding director of the Center of Latin American Visual Studies. She is the author of numerous publications, including a recent book co-authored with Agustin Perez Rubio, Verbo America, an extensive catalog in conjunction with the exhibition of the same title at Malba in Buenos Aires. Verbo America is a new exhibition of Malba's permanent collections, which offers a post-colonial history that does not contextualize Latin American art in terms that are canonized by European art, but rather on the basis of language from artistic experience, through words that the artists themselves used. Verbo America, like Radical Women, proposes a rewriting of Latin American art history that rightfully honors and amplifies the voices of artists. I'm honored to introduce Dr. Andrea Giunta.
Teresa, thank you. Well, I want to thank Cecilia Fajardo-Gil, my great colleague that invited me to participate in this project, and Sylvia for being confident and to support the project, Connie Butler, that it was a friend through this process, the Getty, of course, and all the Hammer staff, because it's great, you know, I come from another world to arrive to an institution with a staff that is highly professional. And of course, and my great thanks for all the artists that were producing this work and being here and participating in the exhibition. Then, you know, when you install an exhibition, you were thinking an exhibition for a long time. After you begin immediately to begin alternative ways to conceive the exhibition. And something that I invite the audience when I am touring through this exhibition space is to say them, you can create your own themes, because the works are in specific themes, but could be in another alternative themes. Then the identification of the works in my short PowerPoint are not with the title of the works, but with the country. And this is intentional, because what I want to underline is the simultaneous processes. Images and poetics are very diverse, but we can see that many artists are working in topics, elaborating in their own works in a simultaneous way. This breaks this idea that they are centers and peripheries, that they are places that are producing avant-garde experimentation or knowledge, and places that are just receiving and adapting. This exhibition, I think, proves that this is a simultaneous process. These two images are included to connect them with the idea I want to present today, that is that the exhibition, in a way, it's producing an iconographical turn. The topic, the title of the session is New Topics, New Bodies, an iconographical turn. Because during the process of the exhibition, what I saw is that usually the body in the long history of art should be has been represented from a patriarchal or through a central eye, an external eye. And what happened in the process of working with the works is that I discovered that it was a new eye. It's an internal eye. It's an eye that sometimes is a crazy eye, remapping the body and providing an extremist huge amount of new knowledge on the body. Then, for example, this image has to do with the idea of also fluids remapping the body, the space, the body understood as an space, the fluency. Then the Marta Palau, in another different language, is also approaching to the body, focus in one section of the body. What we can see is this microscopic way and this way of looking into specific parts of the body. Okay. Then it's which one I have to push here? Green. Okay. Also, the exhibition has a lot to do with fluids and materials that were never included in the world of art. For example, in this case, mud that is applied in the skin directly, then the connection between the skin and these fluids, and time, also the time of trying, but also fluids in terms of female experiences that has to do with birth, that has to do with creation, but has to do also with body and water, or, for example, remapping the body in terms of producing a new image far away from the stereotypical approach that the women body had until now. Or, for example, also involving the body, the tongue, licking, the pop cycle, then the feeling of the body is, I imagine or I visualize through the works that is like a crazy eye mapping different parts of the body and introducing new materials that are very much connected with this new vision. Also, the non-stereotypical vision about some topics that had been conceptualized in a cultural way, like maternity. You have to be happy to be a mother, you are pure, supposedly you have some kind of feeling, and not necessary is in that way. Then you can experiment also the traumatic aspect of being a mother, or you can be angry also. Then the amount of works of this exhibition are providing us the possibility to visualize other feelings, alternative feelings that are decanonizing the way that the society say that we have to feel about some experiences. Also, it was said in the session before it was mentioned queer issues. And then what I discovered working with the works of these artists is that queer as a word didn't exist probably as a concept, but in many works is a queer approach, like here in Polvo de Gallina Negra, this idea that a man can be a mother for one day. And then they are providing devices. They are deframing the idea of maternity and desensitization. The idea of maternity means that, in a way, you can play with this idea, but it's very important in this exhibition, the elaboration of this idea that you can be in the place of the others. It calls a lot to empathy, to identify and to feel yourself with the body of the others, in this case female, but also, as we will see, other bodies. Then something that I find that is very interesting in the exhibition is how the body is approached through different languages and in many cases through sciences. Then, for example, medicine, clinical analysis, or even psychoanalysis. Then these grids or maps, mental maps, that are very, you can connect with Lacanian psychoanalysis in terms of diagrams also. Then a lot of crossing with other languages, also with sociology, as we can see in El Tendedero. The performance is very much involving the techniques of sociology. And going back again to this idea of how queerness is present in the exhibition, we have all these three cases, where sensuality, femininity is in the borders, is crossing the frontiers and including some disturbing things. If you are departing from an essentialist approach, an essentialist point of view. Then also empathy is in Pasarasuri's series, where she lived her place of a white middle-class women, and she went to live to a travesti brodel, and then she was able to recognize that in the margins, in the most exposed area of the society during the military dictatorship of Pinochet in Chile, in this extreme place, feelings of love, feelings connected with the idea of family existed. Then I think that the exhibition calls to all these things, and then I want to make a reflection about that. That is that the fact that this is not an exhibition just for women. It's an exhibition about women artists, but it's an exhibition that is not just about women or for women. Analyzing with the tools of science, I mean numbers, statistics, we arrived with Cecilia to the conclusion that usually the representation of women artists in the world of art is 16%. In the best of the cases, it's 30%. What means that? It means that there is a glass roof, there is a systemic censorship established in the world of art. And this is something that is not an issue or a problem just for women. It's something that affects all of us. Us as a citizens, that we have the right to see the work of art that are systemically hidden, systemically in a way censored. We were talking about decolonization, and I think that the works of these artists are decolonizing the body and opening the body, are producing a kind of explosion of the body, and moving this idea that we are institutionally separated and classified as women and men, but we can feel in different ways. Then through this display of emotions and feelings, focus on, particular experiences and even sections of our own body, they are habilitating the possibility to identify with these same feelings. Then from that point of view, I find that, and I hope that the exhibition also contribute to an idea of a more democratic sensibility, and providing the possibility of an emancipation understood in terms of knowledge, new knowledge, the access to new knowledge. Okay, these are my remarks. I want now, I'm sorry, and okay. I want to introduce the speakers of this session. Claudia Calirman, who is Associated Professor of the Department of Art and Music, John Jay College of Criminal Justice. She wrote extensively about Brazilian art. María Evelia Marmolejo, who is an artist born in Colombia, but she has to leave her country. She's living in the States and elaborated a very complex performances about body and body in connection with violence. Miguel López, who is a researcher and chief curator of Theoretica and was one that really worked a lot for the recovering of the work of Teresa Burga. And Sylvia Salazar Simpson, an artist that, well, she is in the States, but has a lot of connection with Latin America. And, well, I invite them to come into the scenario and to begin the presentations. Thank you. Then we are beginning with Claudia Calirman. Yes, thank you.
So, okay, so let me put my glasses. So I'd like to thank Andrea Giunta, Cecilia Fajardo-Hill, and Connie Butler for inviting me to participate in this panel. And this talk will explore works that engage the tongue as a floating signifier, allowing multiple significations. The three artists that I'm going to talk a little bit about here today, they play with this double connotation of the word língua, which in Portuguese and in Spanish means both tongue and language. So these artists, they explore the tongue as an instrument for the articulation of speech, as a poetic device, as a sign for the mother tongue, the nation, and as a structure for the entrance into culture and the phallocentric order. So, see here. Okay. So Ana Maria Maiolino, she tells a story about her stay in New York, during which a journalist came to her loft where she lived with her then husband, the artist Rubens Gershman, and their two young children. And this journalist came to write an article on Brazilian artists living in New York. So the year was 1970. The artists Ivan de Freitas, Roberto de la Mônica, Hélio Iticica, Amilcar de Castro, and Rubens Gershman, all males, they got together for the interview and photo shoot, but Maiolino was not invited to participate as she was relegated merely to serving the coffee. At that point, she was already an accomplished artist in Brazil, having participated in the seminal exhibition New Brazilian Objectivity at the Museum of Modern Art of Rio de Janeiro, where Oiticica exhibited for the first time his Tropicalia Penetrable. According to Maiolino, it was evident that she was an outsider in the eyes of her husband and his colleagues, and she asked, was that my fault? Which I think is a very typical women's question. Like male-female Latin American artists at the time, she was perceived mainly as someone else's wife and not as an artist of her own. So after a few years after returning to Brazil, Maiolino created the photo sequence What Is Left Over from the series photo poem Action from 1974. In a most poignant image of that series, she holds a pair of scissors as if ready to cut her own tongue. Brazil was then under the most repressive phase of its dictatorship. And for Maiolino, this series was an act of resistance. To cut the tongue also implies undermining one's ability to speak, alluding to the power of language to exclude and subordinate women from hegemonic male discourse. The mutilated tongue as a sign of silence, self-mutilation, and pain is also displayed in Lígia Pape's unspoken visual poem, Stabbed Tongue, from 1968. In a chain of signifiers, the bleeding tongue could also be associated with the wounded nation and with the assault on the right of free speech in the mother tongue. The gesture of sticking out her tongue also implies disobedience and political resistance. Ultimately, the tongue is stripped of one of its most critical functions, the ability to articulate cohesive linguistic meaning. The notion of language as a system of discourse and power is often associated with masculine order. Jacques Lacan's pervasive assertion that language is structured by the paternal law has been challenged by prominent feminist writers. Julia Kristeva, for instance, argues that the paternal law manifested in language creates a univocal masculine linguistic signification. Kristeva suggests that it is precisely through poetic language that lies the possibility of creating multiple linguistic meanings, meanings which are not suppressed by the preordained confines of the male paternal law. In the light of this debate, Papi's work implies a twofold critique of authoritarian order. By self-mutilating her tongue, she defies both the censorship imposed by the military regime and also undermines the paternal order manifested in language by making it unsound and null. The notion of language as a masculine linguistic construction is also disrupted by, in Leonora de Barros' series of photographs titled Poem from 1979. In a metalinguistic game of visual, sound, word play, Leonora's poem presents the tongue first as the spoken language, which then becomes the written language as her tongue is injected into a typewriter. In the first image, a tongue sticks out from a sensuous female mouth, which is identifiable by the lipstick, a conventional mark of femininity. In the second image, the female tongue selectively searches for the keys at the typewriter, probing for a voice through the written word. In the third image, the tongue becomes harder and more erect, pulling an individual letter in a more assertive way. As the sequence unfolds, the action moves into an aggressive crescendo with the female mouth holding the tongue, which now appropriates the male symbolic phallus as it forcefully snaps a few letters. In the next image, the erected, or maybe now aroused, female tongue sucks a few letters from the typewriter. The series culminates with an explosion, a jouissance, a French word that is not supposed to be translated, but nevertheless is always translated as enjoyment, pleasure, orgasm, or orgasmic enjoyment. In this case, it is indicative of the birth of the artist's own writing. In Leonora's poem, the female mouth cannibalizes the phallus, giving rise to what the feminist theorist Hélène Cixous coined as the feminine writing. In her essay, The Laugh of the Medusa from 1976, Cixous urges women to reclaim their bodies and, by extension, their desires and identity through writing. For her, the feminine writing serves both as a disruptive and deconstructive force, shaking the security and stability of the phallocentric order. Moreover, Leonora's poem expands the possibility of the written language beyond the binary opposition of male and female and the normative forms of gender identities, casting doubt on the stability of categories such as women and men by allowing space for fluid gender constructions and dissident subjectivities, as we've been talking here about queer today a lot. So just to conclude, in the works presented here, the tongue takes an iconographical turn, to use a term proposed by Andrea Giunta for this panel, denoting many signifiers at once. It is used as an instrument for the utterance of language, a sign for disobedience and defiance, and moreover, as a tool for enabling the fruition of different subjectivities. Tellingly, all of these works are either titled poem, as in Leonora de Barros' series of photographs, or are referred to as visual poem, as in Papi's Stab Tongue, or are called photopoem action, as in Maiolino's photo sequence, What is Left Over. By referring to them in those terms, these authors insert a poetic language, which ultimately is where a tactical subversion of language can take place. In this series, the work shown here disrupts the univocal masculine linguistic structure by creating a multiplicity of significations with the potential to subvert and defy the patriarchal order. Thank you.
Then María Evelia Marmolejo.
Buenas tardes a todos.
Hello, everyone.
Primero quiero dar
First
las
of all, I
gracias
want to
a
thank
Fajardo
Cecilia
y a
Fajardo
Giunta
and
por haberme
Giunta
invitado a participar en esta
for having
propuesta
invited me to
Mujeres
participate in
Radicales
this
y al
show,
Museo
Radical
Hammer
Women, and to the
de
Hammer
estar
Museum,
aquí, que ha permitido exhibir todas
who's
las
made
obras
it
de nosotras
possible for
mujeres
us
de
to
América.
bring together all of these works by so many amazing women.
Bueno. El giro iconográfico del
So
cuerpo
the
de la
iconographic
mujer ha
turn
sido
in
un
the body of
elemento
women has
central
been
de mi obra,
a
desde
central
los inicios de mi
theme
carrera
in
artística.
my work.
He observado cómo el cuerpo de la mujer
I have
ha sido
observed
el
how
vehículo idóneo para la
female body
representación
has been the ideal
iconográfica
vehicle for
de diferentes
iconographic
acciones
representation in the
y
different actions
situaciones
and
que la
situations
rodean y cómo
that surround
ello
her,
ha
and the
guardado
way
una
this is
relación con la
consistent with the
etimología del verbo.
etymology of the world,
Es
of the word.
decir, se inscribe
In
en
other
una imagen
words,
porque el cuerpo de la
an
mujer
image is
ha
inscribed
sido
because through
históricamente
history,
objeto
the
de
female
actos de
body has been
violencia y
subject to
represión.
violence and
Y al
repression,
mismo
and at
tiempo
the
se
same
ha borrado
time,
o estigmatizado sus funciones más
its
importantes.
most important functions have been erased or
Algunos
stigmatized.
aspectos significativos
Some
que
important
incluyo en mi
features
obra
that I include in
son
my
las
work
relaciones de la mujer
are
con la
relationships
tierra,
between women and
su
earth,
derecho a
their
una
rights
espiritualidad
to
propia,
their own
la
spirituality,
fecundidad,
their
la capacidad
fertility,
reproductiva
and
y
reproductive
denuncio
capacity.
la
I also
desproporcionada y
condemn
continua
the
opresión
continuous and
física y
disproportionate physical
psicológica,
and
las
psychological
injusticias
oppression, the
sociopolíticas
social and
a las
political
que la mujer
injustices
ha
to
sido
which
expuesta,
women have been
las
exposed to,
cuales la
and
han
which have
reducido a
reduced
una
them to a
situación de servidumbre
state of
y sujeción.
submission and servitude.
Invirtiendo el orden de las creencias judeocristianas,
Changing the
hice una
beliefs,
conexión entre la educación religiosa machista que
I
recibí
did
en
an
el
education,
concepto
the
de un
education
Dios
that I
varón. De esta
based on a
reflexión
male
surgió la
God. Excuse me. Sorry.
11 de marzo.
March 11th.
Esa obra la realicé en 1980.
During the 80s, I developed this work. In the 80s, I was deeply touched by the narration I heard of the creation, indigenous myth about the creation of the human race, in which women, with their menstrual cycle, carved a penis, putting it on the earth, and the following day, a man appeared. This image here that subverts the myth and the Judeo-Christian religious myth from the West had a great effect on my approach to the female body because it also touched on personal, intimate experiences. I always had heavy menstrual periods that stained my clothes every month, and this made me target of constant humiliation and ridicule. On March 11th, I changed completely this negative connotation using my own menstrual flow, elevating to its rightful function as a natural life function. I also try to create a more relative perspective, showing that what is natural is also beautiful, generating a sensorial stimulate that transmit that emotion. Changing the order of the Judeo-Christian belief system, I made a connection between the concept of male God education that I received and being a male. From this reflection, the Sesquile work came about, 1985. In this work, I use my own experience of a feminine body that becomes in divine creator, supporting the patriarchal iconography that eludes childbirth from the aesthetic representations of maternity. At a painting level, we've always seen the Madonnas feeding the child or the pregnant Madonna. In this case, I propose childbirth as a artistic work. Here, as the artist, I am the creator goddess. I craft my own creation at a public event where I inscribe in my body, through my ability to give birth, this image of maternity. In front of the Judeo-Christian conception of a male God that creates humanity, I make present a feminist God endowed with a body that is able to give birth both biologically and artistically. And here I propose my son Sesquile as my artistic work. On the other hand, in Anónimo 4, 1982, I established a connection between the fertility of the female body and the vulnerability of a newborn child in an unjust society, economy dealt by men, most of it. This body is a symbol of the social problems that afflict humanity because this new creation, the baby, arrives in the midst of uncertainty of a world plagued by socio-economical injustice, oppression and injustice and oppression, where 11 million children died in the world every year due to starvation, according to the statistics of the 80s. To inscribe this image, I collected the placentas of the babies that had been born in the afternoon and evening before the performance. I excavated a triangle symbolizing the vagina and filled it with placentas, and I also tied up to my body using plastic. The act of unwrapping the plastic wrap is a rebirth in the midst of the darkness of night, highlighting the bleakness of the world to which this new life arrives. Colombia, the country where I grew and was born, has had a history of centuries of political violence and civil war. In Anónimo 1, 1981, I focus on a specific historical moment during my college years where several of my classmates and family members were victims of torture and forced disappearance perpetrated by the armed forces. This performance, me corto los dedos de los pies, I cut my toes, and I scribe my blood, the footprints that were destined to be erased from my country's historical memory. At the end of the performance, an alarm clock rings as a wake-up call, telling the audience that the time has come to awaken from their alienation to the present situation. The act of voluntary cut my feminine body also serves to make present other historical realities that have affected the American continent. In America 1985, I manifest my opposition to the upcoming celebration of an happening that should not be called discovery, but rather a terrible invasion to our continent. I expose this destruction, inscribing with my own blood the name of America in the Monumento de Cristóbal Colón in Madrid, Spain, in the monument of Christopher Columbus, which represents the traditional patriarchal vision of the conquest. I did it on October 12th, the date of Columbus to the continent. I broke a mirror, and with my bloody hands, I distributed in pieces amongst the audience. The reaction of the audience and the authorities led to my arrest. This emphasized even more my proposal against the preparations for the celebration of the 500th anniversary. Being pregnant, I was detained for several hours in a cell for suffering my body, part of that oppression that I was rebelling against. Part of the destruction that the continent has suffered is manifested in the environmental pollution, a problem that I addressed in Anónimo 3, 1982. This work is a ritual in front of the Cauca River in Colombia, which has very high levels of pollution caused both by industrial waste as well as human intervention. In this ritual, I ask forgiveness to Mother Earth for the depletion and environmental damage that we have caused using my own vaginal fluids and body hair as an offering. The earth has been violated and ravaged in the name of progress, and with my body, my fluids, I seek to restore the harmonious connection of human beings with Mother Earth. In my artistic work, I have used organic materials from the female body in order to support the patriarchal iconography that has erased us from the artistic representation. In doing so, I seek to inscribe in the collective memory the fundamental problems that afflict humanity and our planet, calling for a renewed awareness and resistance against recurring attempts to silence women's voices.
Thank you, María Evelia. Miguel López is our next speaker.
Good afternoon. First, I'd like to thank and recognize the passionate and wonderful work of all the curators in this project. Also Connie, Annie, Vanessa, Teresa, who have all been very attentive and very, very happy to have been able to work with all of you in this incredible, urgent initiative in our society. Andrea asked me to think about the iconographic turn from a curatorial perspective. So I want to pose some questions to continue to think through the debates that have been activated by this project. The first thing I'd like to think about is up to what point this iconographic turn has taken place or not within institutional logics, curatorial initiatives, or collecting policies. So to what extent have institutions accompanied or not accompanied radicality in terms of changes in forms of thinking or ways of representing politically the possibilities of the body? The answer, which may not be obvious, is that art and art curation in Latin America, museum programming, curatorial discourses, acquisitions programs, continue to privilege masculine figures. To what level have museums collaborated, or to what extent have they collaborated in processes of devaluing the artistic work of women? It's impossible to deny that museums continue to be models and spaces that produce identity. Their contribution to this production has been enormous, and they model our subjectivities in the social field. What are the public effects of a cultural sphere that's modeled by institutions that show, discuss, converse about, and primarily legitimate the work of men? So in the curatorial catalog, which is titled, that wrote Sylvia Fajardo Gil, it's called The Invisibility of Latin American Women Artists, Problematizing Art Historical and Curatorial Practices. And this is this essay, sort of a detailed cataloging of this issue. I wanted to propose here 3 ideas that are related to these forms and structures of artistic value. So the first has to do with curatorial work. So the fact that the Hammer Museum might agree to do an exhibition of this kind is relevant, not just because it proposes a rewriting of art history in order to unseat it from its patriarchal legacy, but also and particularly because it contributes to a critical redefinition of the horizon of the public sphere. It rejuvenates the foundations of a democratic project. In the process of reorganizing public debate, curators definitively, just like any agents who have any kind of capacity, possibility, or manner to intervene in the way that institutional agendas are constructed, we have a role to play. Curators, and those of us who engage in curatorial practice, we have to be alert to what our position might be in systems of power within contemporary art, and how our decisions have public effects insofar as they might be able to interrupt exclusionary logics or perpetuate them. What I'm trying to say here is not that these social struggles need formal institutions in order to exist. Certainly, organized women's of groups, feminism, and queer activism have always been at the forefront, creating spaces and systems of communication which are autonomous to allow us to think and resist for years. What I want to say here is that it's also extremely important to talk about all of this inside museums and to reflect on another scale, how visual representations were and are spaces of self-representation, of joy, of grief, of rage, of empowerment, and of struggle against discrimination, against homophobia, against misogyny, against racism. And this is where the role of curatorial work is crucial and strategic. We need curatorial practices that are situated, that are aware of their class privilege, and that are absolutely convinced that they are be able to use their cultural capital to create artistic value against a dominant patriarchal culture and against social inequity. It's fundamental in Latin America, where at the moment, in political terms, we are experiencing an incredibly regressive moment. About 6 days ago, we saw some of the exact results of the situation. So the second idea has to do with the ways that current sexual and social struggles, just because they exist, the sensorial contact we have with them allow us to see things differently. So the second idea allows us to think through the relevance, the institutional relevance of certain artistic practices. In my experience as a curator, I've been able to hear over many, many years a number of objections on the part of curators, museum directors, collectors, and other specialists in relation to women's artistic practice and their sex dissident bodies. One of these oppositions is the idea that the relevance of a work is directly proportional to an artistic career sustained over time. That is, if an artista has not been able to achieve certain parameters of success or doesn't have a professional trajectory that's visible, you can hear the quote marks there, for a number of decades, their work is less important in relation to the criteria that are currently considered most important in terms of incorporating their work into the collection of a museum, for instance. The argument that visibility or professional success, whatever that might mean, are the definitions of cultural relevance of certain artistic practices has a perverse effect of naturalizing inequity and the constitutive inequities of the art world, making invisible once again the lack of access and the opportunities that anybody experiences that is still at the periphery of social structures. One of those inequities consists, for example, in not paying attention to the implications of the tasks of maternity and of childcare that many women are responsible for, which generates its own kind of production. The same way that cumulative dynamics of capitalism have historically been based in denying the value of the work of maternity and childcare that many women usually perform. In the same way, the great demand in time and energy that are unremunerated implies for women artists that reproductive and domestic labor is part of what allows men to more rapidly get to levels of fame at a younger age, while for many women artists, those same objectives come considerably later. It's necessary to confront essentialist discourses and demagogical discourses which insist at all costs in comparing trajectories of men artists and women artists under the premise that we are all today operating in conditions of total equality, which, and we must add, the privileges of race, class, and gender determination, which determine access and mobility in an art world that is conformed and dominated to a large extent by social elites. The third idea, and I'm going to end with this, has to do with the problems of understanding what we might call contemporary art. And we could also say we have another iconographic term through a purely Western frame. This means that we might have to ignore, for instance, or not consider indigenous creative practices or originary people's practices, something that is absent in radical women. Beyond that, there's a critique of beyond a critique of this show. What I'm trying to say is to call our attention, broader attention through the criteria of value that we inherit from a colonial structure that's actively operating in Latin America, which informs our parameters from which we read and construct histories in contemporary art. So I'm not just thinking about invoking indigenous people from an urban gaze, as Ana Bella Geiger does very intelligently in Native Brazil, Alien Indigenous Brazil, where she's representing herself in a series of postcards of the era, or in the photos of the artist Claudia, which represent the very, very complex links between indigenous communities and state policies. I'm talking, on the other hand, of self-representation among indigenous artists. That is, creative practices that have been created by indigenous women as a form of documenting their experiences and generating ways of resistance from their own cultural ways of life. So, for instance, the painter Quechi Nancus, who was born in Guatemala, who paints from her way of relating to the earth and to the cultural festivals of her pueblo, but also her own histories of migration, violence, pain, and liberation. These are very, very wonderful paintings that were made in Guatemala. Or the work of the campesina artist Apolonio Dorregaray, one of the principal ceramic artists in Peru, who draws popular customs from her region and religious festivals, folkloric dance and music, and also the travels that her family had to undergo in order to exchange spices and other goods. So it was very important to me to emphasize the idea of indigenous self-representation. So there's a clear an active hierarchy between the tradition of Western fine arts and creative practices of native masters, indigenous artists, and campesino artists. To think about the radical dimension of what women artists might bring or might offer also demands us to create a kind of crisis of imagination around the interpretive frames that serve to help us understand visual culture and to create questionings around our notions of expert knowledge, taste, and artistic value. This way of thinking also might extend in a different way to the presence and subjectivity of Black and Afro-Latino bodies in this show. What is the impact of the incredible work Me Gritaron Negra, or They Shouted Black at Me, of Victoria Santa Cruz, who was a Black artist, one Black artist in an exhibition of more than 100 artists. This is a continent with an enormous presence of African diasporic peoples in different countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. The fact there's only one work from a Black artist is an explicit sign, once again, of the questions of access and visibility and the privileges of race and class that are still subject to structures of colonial exclusion. These are questions that I'm asking myself as a curator, and that anyone who critically participates in the art world should ask themselves.
Gracias, Miguel. Sylvia Salazar Simpson. Sí.
Sí, ¿me oyen bien? ¿Me oyen bien?
Can you hear me? Okay. So let's start with this photographs that I took at one day after traveling to LA after dropping my daughters and her peers in Mexico. I came back running home because I had to pick up all the material to put it up under all the bugs, and I thought that the worms would stay here and they would just like stand like this. As a girl, you know, I thought it would be like that. But then what happened is that I started putting everything up and the worms started like sliding down like this. And I thought, oh my God, what am I gonna do? Because it was an adobe house. It was 5:30 p.m. I didn't want the light to change because for me the aesthetics of what looks pretty I've always liked. So I wanted to look pretty, right? So they would stick, the worms would stick, and they would try to like eat me, and it would hurt. And I was thinking this is not possible, but it was possible. So I made 12 photographs. This is how the film comes in the Rolex. I was doing my hand. We're not valuable at all as women. So having an assistant, why? At that time we had a lot of money, so like an assistant, the gardener, whomever. But now, because you have to suffer, because you're so accustomed to all the, everything that things that husbands do, Walt Disney, who's the cousin of the cousin, etc., etc. So it's really hard to get out of there. Believe me. So, and after, you could see my breasts or not. So it was a mess. So I was alone. I was on my own, but I did it, right? Nothing else to say. Green button. Oh, here it is. Okay. A different day, the girls at home, Mom, we want peanut butter. We want peanut butter. Please wait a little bit. No, we want peanut butter. One of the girls actually threw herself through the window. And everything fell. And I was, please, please, please. I told her, like, I give you peanut butter in a little bit. I love them. They're like 50-year-old now. But to put everything on your head is really hard, especially the piece. You have to put one. It took me 18 years. Yvonne Respro gave me more, brought me some more green beans. And I wanted people who were very intelligent, but I didn't have any other choice. I also wanted to look very pretty. So I called a friend and I told him, por favor, ven, Peter, please come over y dime cómo debo cortar esto. Y me dijo, eres bien tonta, no lo cortes, déjalo así. So this is like this. Por Peter Rodato, he just was like, he couldn't care less, and he told me, please leave it like that. So these are tortillas, pork feet, and the following one I cannot see very well. I don't remember. It was a long time ago. Give me a break. Come on. No, I'm okay. I'm good. Oh, I know. It was chicken wings. So I did it like in about 15 days. Well, my daughters wanted peanut butter. Thank you. I think it's the same. And this is a little bit more aesthetic, like indigenous. It's corn. And the hardest one of all, the green beans, to put them in my head, I had to create like a little nest and then put like a thread and then pull them in like this. It looked great. Oh my God. But it was so hard to do it. But that's been my life, but also it's been amazing. So here we have first asparagus, and of course, I love all these things about woman who's has like band-aids, or here you have the watermelon. This one hurts so frigging much. At the moment of putting the ice cream, it actually burnt me really badly. An assistant, forget about it. We were not rich. So now we were very rich, and now we're very poor, and my husband died. That was it. No, sorry. Yeah, that was it.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias por estas presentaciones. Yo creo que
These presentations, I think that the goal of this panel
puesto de manifiesto
has been made manifest. I think it's really interesting. Maybe this could be an opening question for everyone. The fact that this exhibition, in one sense, is the point of an iceberg. It's the very beginning of a process that needs all of us in order to continue. So this might be in terms of theoretical conceptualization, to elaborate the terminology and the theory, to be able to start to think about this new body that was produced a number of years ago and that in many respects has remained, I don't know, hidden, but maybe also hasn't been conceptualized. As Claudia proposed, also the use of material matter from one's own body, or substances, prohibited substances or penalized substances, as María Evelia was talking about how our language has expanded, the materials of art itself have been expanded, and you, Sylvia, the way that your body becomes the canvas, the way it might be the cloth itself that one might be intervening against. Also this question about the ethics of cultural agents, our ethics, that is, how do we confront these situations, and how do we approach them? How do we project problematics that remain in question? You were part of our team from the very beginning of advisors, and you've been asking these questions from the very beginning, and I know that Cecilia and I, along with you, have been looking to say this art world is so white. It is so linked to a certain social sector. It's almost like you have to look for a needle in a haystack. There's a structural change, a much deeper structural change that needs to be produced, which also has to do with the visualization of practices and the access provide access to sectors that are completely excluded. So I wanted to know if anybody wanted to add anything about. Bueno, voy a empezar. Lo que yo siento es que cuando yo hablo a muchos artistas, estoy haciendo investigación para un libro acerca del feminismo en el arte latinoamericano, y la mayor parte de los artistas
I have been talking to, they say that they feel or they look at feminism not from the point of view of male-female dichotomy, but the feminine as being representative of marginal groups in general. And I think it comes across that in the exhibition by the indigenous image that Miguel shown. So it's not just the woman, but it's kind of this idea of the feminine representing the repressed and the oppressed, being different groups also part of that.
Sí, y yo pienso que
Yeah, I think that we might say
mi pregunta
the question that, of course, is part of Radical Women. This is a question that can be expanded in many ways, and it has to do with how it is that our frames, our interpretive frames, the frames we use for reading, privilege a Western temporal modality, a way of proposing certain logics or certain structures of reasons. And this is highly problematic. So if we think about, for instance, the iconographic term, how can we talk about an iconographic term in a non-urban context, for instance, in a campesino context or in an indigenous context? So these are questions that I think are absolutely urgent to think through, because we've naturalized and perpetuated what we might call a Western structure, a Western discursive structure. And I think that we have an ethical need to break those down, those such heavy, heavy frameworks that impose themselves even within our very language. Well, there's also exists a difficulty that we don't understand the way that indigenous people express themselves. So, for instance, we imagine that they want what they want to say, but we don't know actually that's exactly what's going on. So, I was a little bit. I spent a little bit of time with the Lacandon Indians, just a couple of weeks. It was really amazing, and they use a watch. This way, so that people can see what time, so that other people can see what time it is. They don't have time, they don't have dates, but so it's you who creates the time. So what happens to us is that we approach indigenous peoples as if they were the same as us, but they are not the same as us. That's not how it is. So we really need more time. We need more to do a lot more research. Well. Within my own experience, I also had some experiences with indigenous people. So in my work, that part is also reflected around Mother Earth, the connection, the human connection that we have, which is a legacy from my ancestors. I come from a campesina family. I am mestiza. I am not white. My father, I think he was from my great-grandfather came from Africa. We are mestizo people. So we also have that Afro-descendant part. So in Latin America, we also have indigenous roots, but we are a mix of everything. So as far as my work is concerned, I tried to recuperate a native, Indo-native part of my background, but also the African part of my background, and also the part of what I am, which I was educated in a context, in a society, Catholic society, a Catholic context, very, very macho. So all of that, I am all of that, and I reflect that in my work. And I try to transmit that, and I try to reveal myself, and I try to put emphasis on what we've lost. And that's, among other things, is memory. Okay. The only thing I would want to add is that what the curators always propose to ourselves is never to convert the other into a fetish object, to allow the other to speak for themselves. So the great ethical problem that we're always talking through is if there's sort of a kind of patriarchal protective gaze. The curatorial world's or museographic world's desire to get closer to other cultures, but those are also pose kind of ethical problems. I'd like to open for questions from the public. I'm waiting to see a hand. Anyone want to raise their hand? Okay, so more than a question, this is a comment that there's going to be a possible question tucked into my comment. So in terms of the topic of indigenous people and their cultures in Mexico, in the past, we could say, in a talk with an anthropologist, a multidisciplinary anthropologist who also works with ancient medicines and with contemporary art. So there's a huge division, a tremendous division between our world and the world of the anthropologists. And so the studies, the research that's been done around visual culture, indigenous visual culture, that exists, but we don't know how to incorporate it into our strategies or our curatorial paradigms. This is not a problem of not wanting to incorporate it. It's just that institutionally there hasn't been a way to open up the vision. And so if we're talking about a museum of contemporary art, there is no contemporary indigenous art. they are contemporary, but we think that visual culture in particular is something static. It's millennial, it's traditional only, and that's not true. They also have cell phones, they have TVs, they have all kinds of plastic items, and this has changed their way of their sense of color. So I don't see how we can create a bridge or extend a connection between this kind of knowledge and that kind of contemporary visual culture and the visual culture that we use in our institutions and in our curatorial practices. So that's my, thank you. I don't know if anybody wants to respond. Or another question? Cecilia, yes.
Creo que el tema del indígena es
So I think the question of indigeneity is very complex. So for instance, yesterday, Cecilia Vicuña did a performance where her entire performance, or the entire work that she's done since the 60s involves a concept of indigenous imagination, that kind of return to an idea that's completely in conflict or contradiction with or in opposition to the capitalist system, and understanding that we are part of the other, and that it almost might sound Buddhist, but so there's been work in Guatemala that's been done recently, and so the separation between an indigenous artist and an artist who's not indigenous can also be somewhat artificial. We also need to think historically what is being attempted to be said. So I feel like, I don't know, for instance, among Mayan artists, even the word art doesn't even exist. There's a rearticulation of what art might be able to be, but the sense of what is sacred and this new kind of temporality that we go back to go forward, we go forward to go back. I don't know. I really believe in specificity, and that we can't adapt a concept. But it's true that we can't justify our exhibitions, but there isn't any kind of idea of classification. The community systems they're systems that are that we carry with us, our social structures. So there's also a kind of fear of, I don't know, that we might lose sense of any kind of boundary. Solamente para complementar, también diría que la cuestión del artista autodidacta, el artista outsider, el artista de fuera, también hablando de la cuestión de clase, viniendo de cierto grupo que es el élite.
And we don't see those types of representations, but I think more and more, at least in Brazil, we have been facing, particularly in terms of the indigenous and the Amerindian and even the Afro-Brazilian, more and more we see projects, exhibitions from organized in many different ways, trying to address this issue. We've been, at the museum in Sao Paulo, we've been trying to always bring Amerindian artists from the forest, sometimes they call themselves, into contemporary art exhibitions alongside other contemporary artists working in the cities and with galleries and all that. So far, only male artists, although we found Carmesia, who's a fantastic indigenous Amerindian woman artist, painter, who we're beginning to work with as well. So it's a big challenge. I think we're taking this up, different people, at least with different projects in Brazil, but it's really a challenge. And the next step, when we do, the radical Amerindian, the radical indigenous, we will come up and say, what about the curator? So now we will need a curator, and then we will need the museum, and then the academic. I mean, it's always unfolding, and I think it's a continuous project of decolonization in many instances.
Sí, yo estoy completamente de acuerdo, y un detalle es que la exhibición tiene un
This exhibition has a chronological moment between the 60s and 85, which is very productive in terms of thinking about the present, because in some way we're going toward a time when these decolonial practices or decolonial body practices were just starting to be conceptualized in the artistic field. And in some way, discourse wasn't giving those visibility. But in the same way, I think the kind of organization that we can see in this historical moment is operating in the present. So there's a double moment in what we see and what we can see. And there's also an ethical problem between how do we give visibility in a way that we're not undoing the specificity or unframing the specificity of cultural production that existed in its moment, because now we have certain beliefs as curator. We don't have a response to this problem. We could give a ton of examples that might be evaluated in terms of their success or lack of success, but it is a problem, and it seems that this moment, this historical moment, allows us to work critically around new problems.
I don't know if there, ¿puedo hacer una pregunta? Sí, creo que
Feminism in Latin America, maybe it's about, is including all of that was excluding. But I have a question that going back to the talk in the morning from Graciela Carnaval, she said that she was, in Argentina, nobody was thinking in those terms of feminism or, women issues. And I think that's so important in the discussion of Latin America, how many women were not interested in that kind of discussion at that moment. And I'd like to know, what did you encounter in relationship to that subject?
Well, do you have some, as an artist, that were experienced this time, que tuvieron la experiencia de ese tiempo, quisieran contar su propia experiencia? Yo puedo hacer un
experience,
pequeño
I can give a little summary of what happened to us. Well, I was a teenager in the 70s and 80s, and the feminist movements were already starting. I actually participated in some groups. I was not a militant, but it was very useful as a foundation for what would come afterwards when I started studying art and fine art school. That influence in me, the awakening, because I came from a Catholic school. And art in the Catholic school was macrame and cooking. Because we had to be ladies and good housewives. So, of course, there was a rebellion within me because in my family, everybody, it was 4 men, 2 women, and I had to serve my brothers. On the table, my brother would end the juice, finish the juice. He would raise the hand and he would say, it's done. Then it meant that I had to get up and serve him juice. I was eating with him. So I would rebel, and there were always issues. So coming back to this, I had that experience. And it was very useful to frame the work that I did as an artist. Okay.
Sí, no, sí.
Yes.
Lo que pasa
So
es
what
que
happens is that from one day to the other, there's people who come to the one, like Juan Carlo came to my home, and he said, "Estás pintando en el porche," y dije, "Sí, está tan grande." And he said, "¿Por qué no vienes a CalArts y pintas como una niña grande?"
it's crazy. I'm painting on the porch. It's nice, And those are the things that move one woman and another woman and another woman. But now there are more people in this world, and now more people have to be moved. It has to be really impressive to be a woman art. How did I switch to Spanish, English? Anyway, to be a woman artist is like being an engineer. Come on, it's important, And we have to carry that message. And there are more women will investigate in different ways, different themes. And that's what we have to do. Our personal living relations have to change. We have to be willing to go out there and be, well, right, like with gay men or whatever, You have to do this. And if we don't do this, we're just pretending. We're just pretending that things are going to change. They're not going to change. They're going to change like this because that's the way the system is, But you have to just go out there and throw yourself into something new. And I was thinking, I could go with Cecilia to Guatemala. And I thought, well, Sylvia, you went to Guatemala and you didn't do anything. What are you going to do here, right now, tomorrow, next week? That's what counts. And I appreciate you so much. And the women here are so beautiful together. And I like beautiful. And the whole thing is that really what will change is if we get more numbers to do this. Because otherwise, we'll all be running around in high heel shoes. It'll be a mess. Okay. Bye. Thank you.
Muy brevemente quiero
Very
decir
briefly, I want to say that when we developed the research, it was very surprising to find that the feminist group that from the 70s had some representation and had done some conscious feminist art kept actually in Mexico. There were experiences in different Latin American countries, but those were truncated experiences, and the question was, why do we have a hypothesis? One that dictatorships really avoided with all their curfews and all their measures to control the association, the freedom of association. They really closed associations. They really, for a long time, it was criminalized by the law to get together and participate. And in the second place, the second articulation is that the left militancy and the left formations that are inspiring to total transformation of society, in a way, would delegitimize the micro policies. The struggles that represented different sectors like feminism or gay or homosexual, there's a lot of works like Pedro Lemebel work that has to do with this need of saying and not being able to say and assume freely their sexuality, being a person that was linked to the left, to the Communist Party. So this was also an element after the revolution and total transformation that would modify the place of women. The struggle of women did not have legitimacy, and a lot of women were involved in what they call, or they call the double militancy, being militant in political organizations and feminism, and the erosion work over female militancy. I think that history was also important in that sense. I would like to add. And I think we need to make those stories alive. In Mexico, from feminism, art history has not been told. There's been a struggle that feminism often has considered that art is not very important, something to study. So we need to tell that story from feminism, and we need to tell that story from art. There's a double invisibilization. I think we need to work a little bit more history, and we'll find more there. Yeah, over there, there's another question. I believe it's important to see that we are actually asking these questions and talking about what's missing, because we have the privilege of having this wonderful exhibit that we have in front of us. And I think this is something to celebrate. At the same time, I'm interested in thinking about this idea of different temporalities that invite us to think about modernity and contemporary in different dimensions, and not moving towards a Eurocentric universalism that started with illustration and that was built through the idea of ideal man. And in this sense, I believe that it's not about going back to this indigenous imaginariums, but incorporating imageries of the Black communities that are from the past. But we need to read the multiple temporalities that we live, because Latin America is a place of diversity. And in this sense, I'm also interested in thinking about how these multiple temporalities exist in a place like LA, Los Angeles, where the migration waves, especially from Mexico and Central America, have brought an amount of people that show that diversity and that exist and think and imagine the future with all of these temporalities, and that come from different indigenous groups. So I'm interested to think about how all of these indigenous folks come here with their multiple perspectives and temporalities and ways of understanding modernity to see this exhibit. I'm interested to imagine being someone else and think for a second being someone else and look at this exhibit, because that makes me think, what are we lacking for the future? Not in this exhibit, because I think it's a luxury having this exhibit, but what do we need? What is missing in the future for those audience in the future, so they don't stand in an exhibit and they don't find themselves reflected in the same exhibit. I totally agree, and I wanted to take what Cecilia mentioned about Guatemala. There's very important processes currently of self-representation, and for me that's the key, self-determination and self-representation of indigenous communities. For example, in community, artists in San Pedro de la Laguna are creating documents about their own masters, painting masters that have lived there and are not part of the global art, but are very important for the community, local community. This is happening. It's not from the outside. It's something that is ours. Definitely, it's very complex, and I have a series of very uncomfortable questions, but are questions that we have to make ourselves. If we don't ask these questions, we're going to continue perpetuating a model of cultural production, visual cultural production, that it's anchored in a group of white Occidental bodies, and it's very problematic. So, of course, it's not something that makes exhibit less important, but it's questions that I think we have to confront as people that participate in the ways in which we are negotiating public representations. Is our role, our responsibility. What I would like to add is that with Cecilia, often we think about if we had to arrive to the present, and it was a curatorial decision to make a historical exhibit. Because coming back to a very occluded past, practices that were literally buried, it's also bring a bunch of tools, knowledge, and visibilizing strategies. Is very hard to erase history. We didn't want to erase it for a second time, and sometimes we think the exhibit as if this were the first exhibit of a different necessary one, but we didn't want to dilute the vast knowledge that all of that occlusion brought in terms of being instrumental and it to be absorbed in present in what's happening today, or what can we visualize today. Because there is a process of knowledge and theory that has an anchoring that it's very important to understand the present time. Okay, so they're telling me that I have no time left. We have a second session with Connie Butler. We have 15 minutes for a break. Thank you.